In this session, we're going to take a look at where to focus in an interiors image to create the best impact possible. Now, when confronted with a scene like this, it's obviously important to ensure that your close-up details are nice and sharp, and also the distant elements of the picture appear nice and sharp as well. And you can achieve that by apportioning the depth of field throughout your image as effectively as possible. You're going to help matters, of course, by using a small aperture in conjunction with your wide-angle lens to apportion that depth of field. So the question is, where do you focus in your interiors image to ensure that you're getting the best depth of field possible? Now, this is a situation that a lot of landscape photographers encounter regularly, because what they're after is nice foreground interest that's appearing sharp and distant details like mountains and sky that's equally appearing sharp. And they often resort to a concept called the hyperfocal distance of the lens to determine the distance at which they need to focus to get that good spread of depth of field. And you can look up the hyperfocal distance of your lens on the internet, but let's say for a given lens combination, like a 17mm lens on a full frame camera, this might be, for example, 1.2 meters. So I might look at this interiors image and say, well, this is basically a landscape shot. I need foreground elements nice and sharp, distant elements nice and sharp. So I'll look up my hyperfocal distance, which might be 1.2 meters, and I might put a light stand in my shot at 1.2 meters away from the camera, use a tape measure, put the light stand in, focus on that, take it out of course, and shoot. And that would be perfectly adequate. I'd know that I get a nice spread of depth of field throughout my picture. However, I do feel that for interiors images, there's a slightly more subtle way you can go about this to create an even better picture. And I'm going to illustrate this with a diagram. So if we take a look at the shot from above, I'm looking to focus on a particular plane that passes through my picture, and I want to focus on the plane that's going to give me the best result possible. Now, I use that word very deliberately. In plan, it looks like I'm focusing on a line, but actually it's a plane. It looks more like this. So anything on that plane that runs through the scene is potentially as sharp as possible if I focus on that plane. And that plane is going to be parallel to my camera back and my lens, because I'm using a fixed lens camera. I haven't got a view camera, in which case with a view camera you can change the way that plane is apportioned through the image. But you're still focusing on a plane. Now, at full aperture, that plane will be nice and sharp, and objects in front of it and behind it will become progressively out of focus. And as we know, with a small aperture, you can help to increase the appearance of sharpness in front of and behind that plane of very, very sharp focus. But it's what's known as an acceptable level of sharpness. What's happening with the depth of field is that it is actually receding the further away you get from that plane of sharp focus. So there's quite a skill to placing that very best plane of sharp focus in your image, and it would stand to reason that we place the plane of sharp focus where the lens is really performing at its best, at the plane in the scene that we think the viewer is going to focus on when they view the image. And I throw this one out for your consideration, but I feel that with interiors images, that area is the area slightly further inclined towards the back of the room rather than the close elements in the scene. So if we take a look at the shot itself, and I would normally say to myself as I'm looking through the lens, where do I naturally feel that my attention falls on first encountering this scene? I may well explore it. Having been introduced to the scene, I might start looking at these different elements. I might be interested in the picture. I might focus on, look through to the garden, for example. But on initial encounter, I personally feel that that area there, 3/4 into the scene, almost at the back wall, is naturally where my eyes tend to go to. It sort of feels natural to want to sort of eventually look out through the window. So I chose to make that plane my sharply focused plane. So I know that my lens is going to perform at its very best if I choose to focus here. Now that might not be the same distance from the camera as the so-called hyperfocal distance of the lens. So you have to be careful, because if you focus too far back, then you might find that these near elements are requiring a smaller aperture to be represented nice and sharply. But I think that for the majority of interior shots, a fairly safe rule of thumb is that the viewer's attention is inclined towards the further areas of the room, and you can almost err on the side of having a little bit of softness in the very foreground areas, as long as this area is coming up nice and sharp.